This video was brought to you by Surfshark. Hello friends, my name is JJ and I hope you are ready for my most controversial video yet. So a lot of people think of me as being one of the big flag guys here on YouTube, which only makes sense since I've made a lot of videos talking about flag history and flag mysteries and the politics of flags and so on. But I feel like as the years go on, my whole attitude towards flags is drifting in a more contrarian direction, precisely because I feel like a lot of modern day flag discourse is getting too predictable, conformist, and judgmental. Last year I did a video discussing a few of my biggest pet peeves about online flag culture, and in today's video I want to double down on one issue in particular, namely this whole boring conversation about the supposedly pressing need to change the flags of the American states. Over the last few years, this is a cause that has risen from relative obscurity to easily one of the top 3 flag-related debates in American public life, alongside classic arguments over the meaning of the Confederate flag and more recent fights over when and where to display the Pride one. And it's a cause that I am finding myself getting more and more contrarian about, just because I think the whole conversation is getting way too one-sided, shrill, and smug. Over and over again, you hear this argument that most American state flags are these hideous, badly designed abominations, perhaps among the ugliest flags anywhere. This is very often simply asserted as if it is the most self-evident fact in the world, or at best made by citing various pseudoscientific principles of what makes for a good flag that are supposed to be uncritically accepted. Most of the time, these arguments are made in an incredibly one-sided way, with little to no respect for the flags that are being attacked, or even the mildest curiosity about any possible arguments in favor of these flags. This is easy to do in turn because these unpopular state flags have essentially no public defenders willing to stand up for them and make their case, which has only allowed their critics to get even more flamboyantly judgmental and self-righteous. So with all of this in mind, allow me to humbly offer a couple rebuttals to this beleaguered group of US state flags that are receiving an enormous amount of hate these days. A hate which I am sad to say I once mindlessly participated in, but now feel a need to push back against. But before we get to that, let us hear a brief word from today's video sponsor, Surfshark. Hello friends. So I don't know if you've heard, but the Canadian government, working through its media regulatory arm, the CRTC, is currently having discussions over whether or not to ban Fox News from Canadian TV. Regardless of your opinions on Fox News, I think we can all agree this is a pretty dramatic power for government to have. But alas, the governments of many countries are in the world, including many free countries, do. In fact, as we know from my Bill C-11 odyssey, the Canadian government recently gained the same powers over the internet that they currently have over television. If you are eager to bypass government control of your online experience, then a VPN like Surfshark is an essential tool. When you use a VPN, digital information about your location is swapped out with a virtual location of some other place, thereby tricking the internet into thinking you're somewhere where you ain't. Surfshark has servers in over 100 different countries, giving you the ability to fool the internet into thinking you are just about anywhere, even Bosnia. I wonder how censored their internet is over there. Well, with Surfshark, you can find out. The Surfshark app can be used on an unlimited number of personal devices, and they have the cheapest monthly rate of the big 3 VPN providers. If you are interested in getting a taste of what a truly free internet is like, why not hop down to the link in the thing below and use the promo code JJMCC for an amazing 3 months free when you get a 24-month subscription. And if you are not completely satisfied, they also have a 30-day money-back guarantee. Surfshark, secure your digital life today. So the main rebuttal that I think needs to be made is just that the supposedly bad US state flags embody an important part of American cultural heritage that deserves respect. One of the most common slurs used to describe the bad American state flags is seal on a bedsheet. This refers to the fact that many of these flags simply consist of a blue field with a complicated crest in the middle. Seal on a bedsheet, or the even less subtle SOB flag, are terms that were popularized by Mr. Ted Kaye an official within the North American Vexillological Association, who we will talk about a bit more later. Now, this style of flag is indeed very common in America, with at least half of the 50 states, representing about half the US population, having seal on a bedsheet style flags. But before we start hating, perhaps we should pause for a moment and ask why this is. To begin, what even is a seal anyway? So seals, in the sense of things that look like this, are an ancient tool historically used by important people and institutions to indicate that they have given official approval to something. In their earliest form, a seal was a sort of stamp that could make an impression on a clay disc that was then used to bind up a parchment document to prove who it was from. They sealed the document, get it? But clay seals were heavy and awkward, so people started using stamps on blobs of beeswax instead, and attaching the flattened blob to a paper document. Though today we often imagine these wax blobs as being stuck to the paper itself, historically they'd just as often be hung from the bottom on little dangling ribbons, as you can see here on the Magna Carta. This allowed the blobs to be stamped on both sides with two different designs for greater security. And that mattered because security was a big part of the purpose of this tradition. Written signatures were easy to forge, but an elaborate indentation in a blob of wax was considerably tougher. This also created an incentive to making seals with very elaborate and precise designs, since those were harder to forge as well. The British were very big into this tradition, with the kings of England having very large and grand seals used to signify royal approval. The king's royal governors in America all had seals of their own as well, often with the king's crest on one side and some sort of illustration of the specific colony on the other. According to this book, seals were such a big deal in 18th century American political culture that the founding fathers considered the creation of a distinctly American seal a much more pressing matter than the creation of an American flag. Congress took no action upon the design of the flag when independence was declared on the 4th of July, 1776. However, on that auspicious day, a committee was established to design an appropriate seal for the new republic. The members of the Congressional Congress shared a culture that included familiarity with British heraldry and the use of an official seal of state in validating government documents. Almost immediately upon declaring themselves independent, they appointed the prestigious committee of John Adams, Ben Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson to devise a suitable seal. Since the use of an official flag would at this time have been limited to state buildings, forts, and the limited number of American ships at sea, perhaps no one considered it a crucial point worth troubling over immediately. Clearly, the question of an appropriate flag did not rate the attention that the question of a seal did. This relative indifference to the American flag is one of the main reasons why the design of these stars and stripes varied so much until the latter half of the 19th century, when flags became a much more standardized and commercialized, mass-produced object. But the design of the Great Seal of the United States has been unchanged since its initial approval by Congress in 1782. And it's worth noting that Congress was even moving pretty slowly on this front compared to the states. New Hampshire, New Jersey, South Carolina, and Pennsylvania all designed their own state seals immediately after independence was declared in 1776. Delaware and Georgia followed soon after in 1777, New York in 1778, Virginia and North Carolina in 1779, and Massachusetts in 1780. A few of the original states, like Connecticut, Maryland, and Rhode Island, continued using their royal seals with only slight modifications. As new states joined the US in subsequent decades, making a state seal was always one of the very first things they did as well. To this day, most state governments still have an actual physical stamp of their state seal, and their constitutions still require certain official documents to be sealed. Although these days it is usually done with one of those pressure stamp things, or just a sticker, rather than blobs of wax. Check this out. It is a proclamation of Wildfire Awareness Month, sealed by 8 different governors. In contrast to state seals, which may be hundreds of years old, state flags are a vastly newer idea. Most of the older states went a century or more without ever adopting a flag, just because it wasn't considered that important. Like this guy said, for much of American history, people mostly associated flags with boats or war, so not exactly relevant for a small landlocked territory, like say, Colorado. Around the turn of the last century, however, the idea that a flag was simply a decorative symbol that anyone could use for anything became more mainstream, and this also happened to be the time when a bunch of states were celebrating historic anniversaries of one type or another. The early decades of the 20th century thus saw a bunch of state legislatures adopt state flags for the first time, with many of these flags designed to honor their oldest and proudest state symbol, the state seal. In sum, the decision to have a seal on a state flag isn't simply a lazy or ill-considered design choice. It instead reflects a conscious desire to celebrate what have historically been one of the most important symbols of authority and identity in American civic culture. State seals tend to be very rich in symbolism about that state, with elaborate and often highly metaphorical representations of that state's landscape, industry, and ideals. This does make them visually complicated, but even then, the complexity of their designs is not frivolous, but consciously evokes ancient traditions of seal making that America inherited from England. So I think a case can be made that so-called seal on a bedsheet flags are actually very meaningful American cultural objects. But are they still bad flags? Well, this leads me to rebuttal point number 2, which is that there are no such things as flag rules. The popular educational YouTuber CGP Grey recently made what I consider to be a rather tendentious video bashing US state flags, and he begins it by confidently declaring a set of 5 rules that all good flags should conform to.
1. Keep it simple, something a child could draw. 2. Make it distinct at a distance. 3. Colors or fewer. 4. Symbols, have them. Your colors and what you design with them should mean something. 5. Words on a flag, the ideal number is 0.
He doesn't credit these rules to anyone, which again, I would say just reinforces this idea that the rules of a good flag are objective and self-evident, almost like the laws of nature. But in reality, these rules, which CGP Grey is hardly the first to cite, are actually traceable to a single guy, our old friend Ted K. In 2001, Ted made a pamphlet called Good Flag, Bad Flag for the website of the North American Vexillological Association that purported to offer the distilled wisdom of the world's leading flagspurts. And it was enormously popular and influential, and today you will see Ted's 5 basic principles of flag design repeated endlessly, especially in the context of criticizing the many American state flags that supposedly violate these rules. The big problem with Ted's 5 rules, however, is that they presume flags are a sort of tool that exists to perform a very precise functional purpose. And I'm really not sure that that's true. I mean, certainly when it comes to state flags, their only real function is to be a decorative object. They'll maybe be flown on a handful of government buildings and propped up behind a politician in her official portrait. But beyond that, it's hard to justify having strict utilitarian standards for these flags just because they have such a limited functional purpose. There's no inherent reason for a child to be able to draw the state flag, for instance, or for it to be distinguishable at a great distance, or for it to be free of text, or not look like some other flag, or any of these other rules. These are really just aesthetic preferences, and as some critics of Ted's book have pointed out, they come from a fairly culturally narrow perspective. Basically, good flag is taken to mean flags that resemble the modern flags of Europe, with their limited colors and simple blocky shapes, while any flag that deviates from these norms, regardless of cultural justification, are bad. Now, you could make the argument that since Europeans basically invented flag culture, their norms should set the world's standards forever, even long after the context in which those norms originally emerged, you know, helping ships on the high seas identify one another or whatever, has passed into history. But, as I said in my award-winning video on prescriptive versus descriptive culture, I am personally pretty opposed to any hard rules that seek to suppress creativity and innovation in any cultural realm. The unpopular US state flags are quite old now, in many cases over a century old, but they're nevertheless being demonized in a way that feels deeply reactionary. Do not try something new. But really, I think you could very easily make the case that seal flags actually function better today than they did 100 years ago, just given how much easier it is in the digital age to replicate and share very detailed images, both online, in print, and even on souvenirs. It is kind of weird how often flag debates just wind up being about souvenirs. In other words, it feels kind of needlessly backwards to be demonizing the existence of detailed flags in an era that has never been more technologically and culturally equipped to accommodate them. In a true cultural free market, perhaps it is even inevitable that flags of the future might look more like this than this. I think the strongest argument against seal flags is just that the Americans who live in states that have them don't tend to have a great deal of emotional attachment to them, which I think we could say is one of the objective functions that a good symbol is supposed to fulfill. The easiest rebuttal would be that this is just a lack of education situation, however, given that most Americans are not terribly aware of the significance of their state seal in the first place, and why their state's leaders, many decades ago, might have considered it something worth honoring. But beyond that, I'm not terribly sure that lack of love for a flag is something that can be blamed on the flag's design alone. Here in British Columbia, for instance, we have a flag that is quite beloved and I would say is a pretty big part of our culture, despite the fact that it has a bafflingly complicated design that even a British Columbian as bright and patriotic as noted TikTok hunk Ben Kalashinsky can't draw it from memory. Okay, Benjamin, show me.
This is the British Columbian flag.
Okay, and what do we see here? Can you describe what you've drawn?
We have our beautiful ocean here, where our sun will set, followed by our love for the British, which is the Union Jack.
Okay.
And I would say this is 83% accurate.
Okay. My own sense is that the affinity a place has for its flag is due to a lot of complex cultural factors, of which flag design is a significant but not exclusive one. I also think it is equally true that the amount of affinity and identity a people derive from where they live does not obviously in any meaningful way correlate with the look of their flag. New Yorkers have a sense of identity that is every bit as strong as Texans, despite one place having a quote-unquote worse flag than the other. So in short, maybe state flags don't even matter that much. Give them a break. If you live in a state with a seal flag, take pride in the proud American tradition it represents. And don't let the haters tell you you're doing it wrong just because you don't conform to some guy's 22-year-old instruction manual. Flags are for the people, and while I won't oppose any state that chooses to update theirs, I also refuse to shame anyone who looks at something like this and goes, you know what? It's fine.